All right.
Okay, so number 23, I realized that all of the problems in 3A, the 3-1A section, the answers are in the back. I just want to see the process.
Are we in A then or B?
I'm in A.
Okay, go into A.
I circled number 23 because it was like number 22 in the other section, and I kind of struggled with that a little bit.
Okay, okay.
So the first one is four,
Do you want me
three,
to share my
two, base
screen
5.
as we do it, or how do you
Yeah, we
want
can
to do
do
this?
that.
Okay,
That'll probably make
okay.
it
Why
easier so
don't
I
I
don't
do
have to
that?
keep looking.
Okay, we'll do that. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Sharing right there. Sharing is caring. And we are up here in number 23. So I'm just going to get a little bit of extra white space so we have room to work. All right. And you said 23, so I'll get rid of everything else. Okay.
Yeah.
And yes, every answer is in A. So even though this is part A, doesn't matter, right? If you're trying to understand it, sometimes it's nice to have the answer to check and make sure you're on the right track and then jump over and hit the other one. Okie dokie.
So 4, 3, 2, base 5. So
Hmm.
I know um that obviously all the numbers we have are 0 through 4
Okay, and how do you know that?
because we're in base 5.
Base 5, so it's a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. That's all I have. Okay.
I'm going to start from the first digit, which would be 4, left to right.
Okay, so 4.
But so I need to figure out how many groups of 4 are in this place. But no, wait, I should do the place values first. The first one would be ones,
Okay, so the first one is ones. Okay.
and then it would go to fives,
Then fives. Okay.
and then it would go to tens, correct?
Tell me how you got there.
Because if we're working in base 5,
Hmm.
then each place value goes up by 5.
Adding 5?
No, wait, hold on.
Okay.
So it would be one, we're multiplying, correct? So
Okay.
it would be 20, would it be 25s if we're squaring it?
25s. Okay.
25s. Oh my goodness. See,
What kind of a sequence is it? Gotta just remember
geometric.
geometric. So that
That's
means
so annoying. I definitely did
multiplying,
that on the test.
multiplying. Oh no. But go back to anytime you struggle with this, Alex, just go back to your base tens. Ones. What's your next base in base 10? Got ones.
Um, Tens,
Tens. And after that, would you
hundreds.
say 20s?
No, because then I'd be multiplying by 2 or adding 10.
Multiplying by 10. We're not going to add 10. We're going to multiply by 10. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because when I get up to 9 of this, if I have one more group of 10, don't I just bring it over and call it a group of 100?
Yeah.
So the next place value is really 10 groups of 10. You can picture it that way. And it is 100, yes. But just like then over here, I'd have my ones, then I'd have my groups of 5, and then I'd have 5 groups of 5 would be my next place value up. And that also might tip you off as to the 25 that way, maybe. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
What's next? And welcome, Danielle. We are recording at this point in time. And at the end, Alex will decide whether she wants to post it for every student in the class or just have it sent to the two of you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye. Okay, Danielle, do you know what to do after this? What is your next step? I'm blanking. If you are too, that's okay.
Um, write all of them in base 10. Right. Which one are we writing right now?
400, well, not from 432 in base 5.
Um,
Good job, Alex.
write them in base 10. So, wouldn't you write 1, 10, 100,000? Or you would only go to 100, and then you would have to see how many times 100 goes into 432 and do it that way?
Wait,
No.
look at what you have written right now. What does this 2 represent?
Ones,
How many?
2,
What does the 3 represent?
3 sets of 5,
How much is 3 groups of 5?
15,
What does that 4 represent?
4 groups of 25,
How much is that?
100. 117. Well,
You were
that was
already in base 5, right? So the place values that are there tell you what the values are worth. And when you multiply them out, like with a calculator, you're turning things back into base 10 that you're used to. So
so we don't have to, if we're going from
this is almost
fives
like the
to,
quick way, almost if you think about this, maybe this is the easy way as you go.
is that only going from fives to tens though?
It can go from 2s to 10s or 12s to 10s. Go from any place value into 10s, you do the same thing.
Oh, okay. So, but only when going to tens.
Yep. If I said turn this from base 5 into base 7, ooh, then I probably would make a pit stop in base 10 first and then convert to base 7, just so I have a good base. That's nothing wrong with that.
Okay.
All right, Alex, you want to try the last one? Want to do part C?
The last one?
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, yeah. See, that's one that would definitely have caused me a problem.
So
So when
walk
we're
me through it.
using the letters, excuse me, we're using the letters, it's because we have gone over 10
That's correct.
or we've gone over 9.
Well, really 10 because you got to count 0.
Okay.
0 is one of our digits. So I like what you're thinking. So when you see base 12, you think I already used up 0 through 9, which is 10 symbols. But how many symbols do I need in base 12?
11,
Well,
12.
like in base 10, we would use these 10.
Right.
So in base 12, we would need 12 symbols. So
0 through something.
0 through 9 is, there's your first 10. But now I need you to pick up 2 more symbols. What are they?
Um, the E stands for 11
Okay,
and T would be for 10.
there we go. There's our symbols.
Okay. So if I put this into the place values,
Okay, go for
um, E would be in the ones place,
it. Okay,
and then the second place would be 12s.
that'd be groups of 12. Good, I like it. Yep,
Yeah, and then the third one would be groups of 144.
because you ended up at
Because wait, what?
12 groups of 12, right? Kind of like what
Yeah,
you did a
and then
moment ago.
I had to square the 12.
That's fine, sure.
So we're going up by squares or
We're just
multiplying
multiplying by
by
12 every time,
okay,
one step
multiplying
to
by
the
12.
next. Yeah.
So I multiplied 12 by 12 and got 144.
Oh,
So I'm looking for how many groups of 12 are in 100 and wait, 900
what base are we living in?
12s.
So, can you tell me what this 9 represents?
9
9 what?
groups. 9 groups of 144.
Okay,
So I need my calculator.
probably. You might not. I don't know. You say you struggle with math, but I don't know. Maybe you're a savant and you can just look at it and figure it out. I don't know.
No, I'm definitely not. I'm getting my calculator right
Let's see here. So
now.
900, so 12,
9 times 144
mhm,
is
200
1296.
and yeah, there we go.
Wait,
Okay, that's just that part. But we don't need to put equals at that point, right? We could just put a plus sign at the end because we're not done.
yeah, we're
Okay,
not done. So
what's the 2?
then
What's the 2 tell you?
the 2 is 2 groups of 12.
2 groups of 12. Okay.
So that's 24.
Uh-huh.
And then 11 ones.
There you go.
So it's, oh, hold on. I need to plug in my computer. It's going to die on us.
Don't do that. Don't let it die.
I'm trying not
No.
to. No. should have thought about this earlier.
Danielle's sitting there like, yeah, my phone died the other day doing one of these, so I feel you.
Really? Okay, we're good. I got it.
That was so close,
Sorry.
Alex.
It
That
was
could have
really
been
close. I was
that could have been
scared because this
tragic.
computer kind of sucks and I was worried it was going to do that. Okay.
Okay.
1,296 plus 24 plus 11 is 1,331. Base 10.
There you go.
Then let's find one where I have to, okay, there
Go
was
the other
one.
direction,
Yeah, maybe let's go in the other direction.
right above it.
Try that.
Right above it. Question 22 in part A.
Okay.
Right? Isn't that what it says?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, something like that would be good. I'm turning up my brightness.
Especially now that you got it plugged in.
Yeah, now I can turn
Now you can see everything.
There we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what's the first one?
4, 5, 6.
Okay.
Turn that into base 5.
4, 5, 6 into base 5. Okay, so the first one would be, and I'm turning it into tenths, or what am I doing?
So convert each of the following base 10 numerals. So the numeral is in base 10. And
Okay.
you're going to convert it into base 5.
Oh, okay, from 10 into base 5.
Yep.
Well, right now it's ones, tens, hundreds, but it needs
That's what
to
it is
be,
right now. Yes.
it needs to be in fives.
All right.
It needs, and then in 25s.
Okay, hold on. So are you doing place values right now? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm trying to
Okay.
write them somewhere so that I
So
have
ones.
a reference. Ones, fives, 25s, and 125s.
What would come after that, just in case we need it?
I can't do that in my head.
You can grab a calculator.
125 times 5 is 625.
Okay, so now, do we need that 625 group?
No,
Why
it's
not?
too big because it's only 400 or 456. I don't have a
There you go.
need for that.
There you go.
Perfect. So I can go straight to 125s.
Yeah.
Let's see how many groups of 125 are in 456.
There you go.
It's weird because I know I'm not supposed to think of it as 450. Well, I can think
You
of it as
are.
456 because it is.
Because it is base 10. It is 456 in this case.
Okay.
Yeah.
456 divided by 125
Okay. What'd you come up with?
is 3.6. So we'll put 3 groups of 125.
Okay, so we'll put 3 in there. And again, you did 456 divided by 125, and you got 3.6. You said something, right?
Yeah,
So
so
that's the 3 goes in there. Okay.
yeah, but then I need to subtract that number from the original number, right?
Okay. And let's see what's left over.
125 times 3 is 375.
Okay.
But 456 minus 375.
Mm-hmm.
is 81.
Okay, so you got 81 left over.
Okay.
Do you have enough for another group of 125?
No, so I have
Okay.
to go to the 25s.
Now at least you know you're done. Like you're convinced. There's no other groups of 125. Okay.
Yeah,
All right, let's go to the 25s. How many 25s can you get?
2 groups. Oh,
Definitely
wait,
two groups.
no, 3 groups.
Three groups. You sure?
25 times 3 is 75, right?
Okay.
So 3 groups
So
of
three groups there.
25.
Okay.
Um, 81 minus 75 is 6. So
Okay.
I'd have 1 group of 5s and 1 group of 1s.
All right. There it is. You just rewrote it in base 5.
Okay, and then 1. Oops. Let me write 5. Okay, solid. I think that makes sense.
Danielle, I can't tell you good with this as well, or you already were good with that part, or you struggling with this still?
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
tell from your facial expression, so I figured I better ask.
I'm good. I'm good
Okay.
with it. I did it over here and then I was listening to Alex talk and I was checking my work as she was talking.
Okay, perfect. All
Okay.
right.
Should we do the next one?
If you want another one, sure.
I do.
Okay.
Let's do another one. 1782 or 1782.
I tell you this, what about this? What if I stop for a second? Danielle, you give it a shot. Alex, you give it a shot. You just do it on your own paper, and then we come back and check in.
Okay.
Okay.
That
So
way
we're
it doesn't
doing
interrupt if you got thought processes going on. You finished it. We're going to do B because
Okay.
that's the one she said she wanted. Okay, we're going to write it in base 12. The number is in base 10 to start, just like the one we just did. And we're going to put it into base 12. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So I'm going to be quiet for a second. And also, my wife just got home, so I'm going to go say hi to her. But you keep working. I'll be
Okay.
right back. All right. Do you want me to put what I would have done on screen and you can check yourselves, or do you want to talk through it? Which one you want to do?
Yeah, you can start doing it and I'll see if I did the same thing as you. Are you cool with that, Danielle?
Yeah, but I think I made a boo-boo. All right. I don't know what I just did. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think, okay.
So I don't know about you, but the biggest one I got was 1728. I could have gone bigger, but I realized it's so close to this number, there's no point in going bigger than that. So I got 1728. The number here was 1782. So I can definitely have one of those big groups.
Okay.
Does that sound familiar?
Mhm.
And I got left with 54.
Mhm.
And if I got left with 54, that means
That, yeah, you
don't
don't have
have
any
enough.
groups of 144.
I don't have enough for it. So I might want one, but I don't have enough money for it. So then I come over here to groups of 12, and I can put groups of 12 in here, and I probably would have put in 4 of them, right?
Yeah.
12 times 4 gives me 48. And when I subtract, I would have had 6. And there is my final answer.
Oh, what? Why did, okay. I got everything except for I put 3 in the ones place for some reason. I don't know why I did that, but everything else was
I think I got those pieces here. So did I multiply by
no,
12 correctly?
I probably just put it in my
12 times
calculator
12
wrong.
times
I put
12,
mine in the calculator
1728.
wrong the first time too. That's why I had to redo it. I was like, something's not
Yeah, I
right.
think
Well,
so.
that's
Just
why
don't forget it
I
at the
have to
end.
write everything down like that because calculators.
So
It's hard to follow it.
1046.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't usually do the whole calculator piece until the very end. I get all my little pieces and then I go back and I say 1 times 1728 plus
Oh,
4 times 12 plus 6 times 1, and I get 1782, and I know I'm
That's
in a
how I
good place.
caught mine was wrong. It wasn't
By
adding
checking at
up.
the end. Good.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Check at the end.
okay.
Okay. So I
Looks
feel a little
good.
bit better about going in and out. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me feel a little bit better about it.
Okay. Anything else?
What about, okay, so can you scroll down to number 29?
Number 29. So now they give you base 10 and they say write it in these 3 other bases. They give you
Okay,
base
yeah,
2.
see,
Yep. Yep.
that's just this, it's just the same thing, just
It's
back and
exactly
forth.
the same thing. So if it's not base 10 to start with,
Yeah,
put it into base 10 because then you'll feel more comfortable as you move that into other number bases.
okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Yeah, try that. You want to try one? Which one you want to
I'll
try?
try, okay, I'm gonna try to do 37
37 base 10. Okay.
and then just kind of,
See where we end up.
and then I'm thinking maybe like we don't have to meet to do this, obviously. I'm just thinking like tomorrow and the next day I'll do like a couple of these
Yep. Just practice, practice, practice.
to do it again.
And
Okay.
you can pick your own numbers too. It's not like these are special numbers, right? They said 37 and you come home tomorrow and you're like, I'm going to try 72. Okay. Try 72 because you can check your work. when you're done, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
can see, did it work? Did it give me 72 when I do the multiplication? So don't make it harder than it has to be. All right.
So we're doing which one?
I think she said she wants to start with A,
Okay.
Yeah,
which
we'll just do A really
means
quick.
we'll give you a number in base 10 and you have to write it in each of the other number bases.
Okay, so in base 2,
Hmm.
it would be, let me see. Your place values would be ones and twos, obviously.
Hmm.
So if
Keep
we're
going.
looking, oh,
Keep
threes.
going. Ooh.
Oh wait, no.
Do you want to rephrase that?
T?
Hmm.
No, because that we can't do that.
You're going into base 2, right?
4.
And why'd you say 4? Because now I think you might be guessing. Why'd you say 4?
Because if we're in base 2, we're going up multiplying by 2. So it'd be 4.
Okay. You convinced me. We'll keep going. What
You
comes
know, I
next?
swear I said I did have a reason for saying that.
Okay. But anything after that, or are we just going to stop here?
Uh, we could go to 8 if we
8?
wanted
Okay.
to, but I don't think we need to.
You don't think so? What number do you have?
37. Oh yeah. Okay. Okay, so
This is up to you. If you don't want to
10.
go any further, okay.
No, 16. Ah,
16?
16. Um, and then 32, I believe.
Okay.
Then
Just
for
double it. You got this. Just double it. Double
um
62. Double 32, sorry. Double 32.
64.
64. There we go. All right.
Okay, so
You
now
tell
we've
me when
gone
to
too
stop.
far.
Now we gone too far? Okay. So we don't need this last
So
one.
no. So we're
All
gonna
right.
do we've got one group of 32
Okay.
and then no groups of 16, no groups of 8,
Okay.
no groups of 4,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
It's up to you. You tell me.
Wait, okay, wait. 37 minus 32 is 5. So no groups, one group of 4. And
Okay.
then no groups of 2, one group of 1.
And you could check it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
All right, Danielle, what would you change if we decided to turn this into base 5? What would you do different?
Start out writing the multiples of 5. So 1, 5, 25.
You know what? Let's see this. Maybe I don't even need the line. Maybe at this point you're so getting used to the line, I don't even need it. Okay.
And then we wouldn't go any higher than 25 because then that would be more than 37.
Okay.
So 25 only goes into 37 once. And then we have 12 left over, so 5 can go into 12 twice. And then we would have 2 left over, so then we would have 2 groups of 1.
You. That didn't feel like it was that bad, but you
No,
tell me if I'm reading the room wrong.
no, it wasn't bad.
Okay.
I'm just annoyed that I could not do this 2 days ago.
I kind of like doing these now.
You're like, oh, okay, that's not bad at all. And
Yeah, I
honestly,
was
when you get
like,
with your kids, when you have, so Danielle with your kids and Alex when you later have kids, then you can actually play fun games if you have even just a set of poker chips, because then you could be like the poker chips would be counting like by fives. And so like over here, you might have blue chips for this one. You might have red chips for this, and you might have white, something like that, right? And you could say, okay, so if I give you a blue chip and a red chip and two white chips, whatever, how much money did I just give you? And then they have to count. Okay, well that's 25. And two of these, okay, that's five and five is 10, right? And they're doing the same thing that you were just doing. And they're really getting to learn those big ideas from place value as well as a little multiplication, a little addition, right? Why not? Math can be fun.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense now. So to prepare for 3.2, just kind of do these and
Did
what
you
are we?
look at 3.2?
I haven't yet because I
You
was too
didn't?
scared. I haven't yet because I was too scared of 3.1 and now I'm okay with it. So we can look at it now.
Okay. All right. Well, guess what? Guess what big word it starts with?
Before we get off
Addition.
here, can we
Oh,
do one of the Venn diagrams?
Oh, yeah.
Because I
one moment.
absolutely
Okay.
failed
Sure.
that
Okay.
portion.
Let's see.
I
We got a
got to it
first
and my
page
brain
one.
was not
Is there going to be
processing
a day
anything.
where we go over the test in class at all or no?
I typically don't, but I give you all the opportunity to go back and look at the test, fix your
Oh, yeah. I forgot we're doing
mistakes,
test
learn from it, so
corrections.
you have the
Yeah.
chance
Okay.
to go back and say it. But yeah, it's addition. We look at it with different models, like how could you do it on a number line for kids as they first learn addition? Think about kind of walk four, then walk another three kind of thing.
Oh, I remember
We
those.
look at ordering them and how do we define things like what's greater than or less than? Um, and we definitely want to use things like what we know. And in this case, addition is a huge help to defining what number is less than another number. So if you have to add a natural number, which is kind of like a positive number to one number to get to another, then that number's smaller. For example, if I have to take 3 and I have to add like 7 to it to get to 10, then I know that 3 is smaller than 10. And so we get this great new idea about relationships between numbers as we go forward.
Hmm.
And then we start looking about, tell me about addition. Well, addition has some really cool properties. We get to talk about the properties. Then we get to talk about how do you add things when you're learning. So this is from grade 1. And they have pictures here to kind of say, wait a minute, how do I do 7 plus 4? And they start talking about how you start teaching kids. The goal of this class is not how you do the teaching part, it's making sure you understand the math. But you can kind of get picture glimpses of like, okay, I see what we're doing. And these are number counters. And so if you're working with young kids, you might use number counters. And you have like a grid with 10 in it. And the goal is to make groups of 10. And that's basically the idea of regrouping, right? So 7 plus 4, I have to regroup to make a whole group of 10. And so they get to practice. It's kind of cool. And then we get to learn all the different systems. So I will show you probably 5 different ways to add numbers that you've never seen before. And there you go.
Okay.
I
Okay,
know,
that's fun.
exciting. It's so exciting. Well, I think it is 'cause once again, once you have addition, you feel pretty good with the idea of addition. Most students do. And so it's a little bit more perhaps in your wheelhouse than Venn diagrams or geometric sequences. That probably just isn't something you've done much. But as you
Yeah.
can see, we need geometric sequences because they build. I'm jumping into Canvas now, and I'm going to go to that chicken problem I thought would be a good one, Danielle. The Venn
Okay.
diagram.
Yeah, I kept trying to break the problem down but then I was getting really confused because I had circles, I had rectangles, I had all these different places I could put all these different labels and it was just
Okay. Well,
overstimulating my brain and I
you're
couldn't
like,
even
what?
think about
Okay.
where to put stuff.
Let's see your link to Scott's Solutions. And I think it was Let's Get Loopy, if I remember right. Because I'm pretty sure in Let's Get Loopy I said, and here's Scott's famous chicken problem.
Yep.
There it is.
Yep.
Now I agree, I really threw a curveball because instead of saying hens and roosters, red and brown, fat and thin, I think I said shiny and
Rubies.
dull, rubies and opals or something like that, and
Yeah, you did.
small and big or whatever it was. So,
Mm-hmm.
but concept is exactly the same. So I wasn't trying to change the concept at all. Tried to keep it exactly the same as what we had during class. So, all right. So let's take a look at this. Notice there's a bunch of clues, just like you had on the test question, right? I
Mm-hmm.
always I give you enough clues to solve the puzzle. Some people are like, well, how come you didn't give us extra clues? You didn't need them. But let's take a look and see what we can figure out. Do we know certain total amounts?
Mm, yes.
All right. Just point it out because the other ones are very specific, like 8 thin brown hens, fat brown roosters, right? So those are very specific. But these 3 pieces right here are huge because they give you a lot of clues. So they also might help you decide what to put as your labels. So what might we put as our labels based on that?
So in the circle, we would put fat,
Okay, so that's the fat circle right there.
and then red
Okay, I'm gonna put red here. That's fine.
and hens.
And
Oh,
hens.
I
And
thought
now
we
I've
had
got
to
my
label
labels.
those separately.
Well, you had to label them. But yeah, I've had people try to solve the problem without labeling, and I have no idea what each circle represents.
No, I was trying to label. I thought that the squares and the rectangles and the circles had to be labeled two separate things. So I was trying to make literally one, two, three, four, five, six different
There's a lot.
circles.
Yes. But again, if I have but think about this, Daniel. If I like, what is this circle now that I've got it labeled? What's in here?
They're fat.
Okay, so what do you know about this one over here? This little chicken over here?
They're not fat.
Done. In this case, it'd have to be thin because there's only 2 options. So I don't need a label for fat and a label for thin. I need a label for fat, and everything that's not fat will just be outside that label. So this goes back to kind of that thing we did in class with the blue and the hexagon and all those pieces, where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
what labels could you choose? And those you kind of got to pick a little bit, but all right. So now you've got some labels on there. Let's go back up and see if we've got some clues.
Okay, so there are three fat. Okay, so that would go into the I part between fat and red. It would be, yes,
Right
3.
here.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, because if I put it right there, they would be fat and they would be red, but they wouldn't be a hen because they're not in the hen circle.
Oh, so they would need to go in the middle.
Okay.
Okay, and
Does
then
that,
there are,
before we go on, does that click?
yes, because it
Is,
matches, it's in the fat, the red, and the hen. It's in all
okay.
three, within all 3 of the
Yeah,
circles.
okay. All right, let's go to the next one then.
Okay, and then there are 9 thin brown roosters, so that would be on the outside of the circles.
Okay, there we go. Because they're not fat, they're not red, and they're not hens. Okay, so we'll cross that off as we're done with them. There we go.
24 animals are fat or red. Um,
Okay.
so I think that would go above the 3 in that area.
What does or mean though?
That means one or the other.
Hmm. So that means they could be anywhere in fat, right?
But they could also be anywhere in red.
The only problem, and hopefully you remember this from what we did in class, is when I do shade all the fat and then I shade all the red, we get a piece that's been shaded twice.
So it would need to be 21.
So we would need to remove that piece that was shaded twice, and that would be using what we did in class. I asked everyone to come up with the equation. Goal of the equation is to take the individual circles, fat and red, and if you add them together,
hmm
just take all the fat, take all the red, and add them together. You got to be able to say, no, I am double counting some stuff, and I have to take out what I'm double counting. And at the end, I'll get to the 24. Does that part make sense? 'Cause this is what
Yes.
we did in the in-class activity. If not, then you got to tell me so that I can go back. But remember, if you have one and you have another, if you count all of this side, you've counted that middle piece. If I count all of this one, I also counted the middle piece, but I counted it twice. I can't have it twice, and that's why I have to subtract the middle piece one time to make up for that.
Yes.
Okay, so we're good with that. All right, so do you know how many fat chickens there were?
No. What? Those are brown. Um, I know there are 16.
16 fat ones? Okay,
Yes. And then there are 18 red.
okay. Minus, I'm going to make it a big
Um,
question mark because I don't know that number. But we got to end up with 24. So I'm going to pause for a second, make sure I'm not going too fast. Does that kind of make sense? All I'm doing is putting in the pieces I know, and I'll just put a question mark if I don't know something.
Okay.
So they didn't tell me how many fat and red chickens there were, right? They said fat
oh, and that also said
or.
it doesn't specify if it's roosters or hens.
Doesn't tell it. Doesn't tell us at all.
Okay.
So it's almost like that hen circle doesn't exist for a moment because we're just looking at the fat and the
Just
red.
just the fat and red. Okay.
So let's do a little bit of math. Calculator if you need to.
So 16 plus 18, 34.
Okay. 34 minus question mark is equal to 24.
So 24.
I heard one of you say it. I think Alex, you just said it, right?
Yeah.
So you can go through and do algebra, Danielle, if you want, but you can also just pause for a second and say, wait a minute. If I had $34, how much did I have to get rid of to end with $24?
10.
10 bucks. There's your 10. But now go back. What did the question mark represent?
Fat and red.
Fat and red. Let's go back to our picture. Where are the fat and red chickens?
That would be above the 3.
Those would be fat and red roosters. Did this one say fat and red roosters or just fat and red?
Just fat and red.
So fat and red would be anything that is fat and red.
Because it doesn't specifically say.
Doesn't tell us. And how many have to be fat and red?
So that would mean that it would be 8.
There's 10, right? We know there's 10 fat
Or
and red. And you already wrote down the number 3 here. So how
7.
much? We got to have 7 left above it. That's a horrible 7. Let me go back. There we go. Okay, so now let's check. Looking at this picture, are there 10 chickens that are fat and red?
Yes.
Because that's this whole region right here. And you look and you're like, I got a 7 in that and a 3 in that. Perfect. Okay, so we're looking good so far. Okay, so we just used that clue. What's our next clue?
There are 5 fat brown roosters. So roosters are also going to be outside of the circle. So
Outside of which circle?
all of them.
Mm,
No? Well, I don't know how I would do that. Well, I guess they could just be in the fat circle. So only the fat circle.
Give me a hint. Is it to the left of the 7, the left of the
To
3?
the left of the 7.
Okay, and how many do you want to write there?
5.
Was that the 5? Okay. Because they are fat, that where I wrote the 5, those are fat, right? Are they
Yes.
red?
No.
So they got to be brown. Because remember, there's only 2 options. Okay, so they got to be brown. And are they hens?
No.
So they got to be roosters. So that checks. 5 fat brown roosters. Okay, done with that clue. What comes next?
All right, so there are 8 thin brown hens.
Okay, where's that
In,
gonna go?
so that's gonna have to go in the hens
Good, because we
circle
see hens. Yep, yep.
only. The hen circle, it can't because they're
Give
not
me
red and they're
some of the
not fat.
reds. Yeah. So outside of fat, outside of red, but inside of hens. And what number do
Yes.
I put?
8.
Is that where you were thinking?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you take a look at this picture, I hope you're looking at it and you're going, we have 3 missing pieces.
Mm-hmm.
But I've given you some clues. How many were fat?
16 total.
16.
How much have we used?
5 plus 7
Keep going.
plus 3
Keep going. How much is
plus
that?
8.
Ooh, is the 8 fat?
No, wait, so
Okay, so
just
don't
5
include the
plus
8.
7 plus 3?
How much is
Yeah.
that?
15.
Thank you. I
But
was
how
looking
many,
up to do.
but how many
I
fat
was
ones?
opening my calculator. I was not even gonna try to.
So we got one left.
Okay, so you okay if I put a 1 here?
Um,
Wait, I thought
yes.
we were doing it in red. No?
We had 16 fat ones.
Oh.
So 16 fat
Oh,
ones
okay,
have
okay,
to
okay.
be inside the fat circle.
Okay.
So do you see why I wrote the 1 where I did?
Yeah, I had red in my brain, but I should have
Okay.
been thinking. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next clue. The next clue is, what's our next clue?
18 are red.
Okay. Alex, you want to take this one?
7 plus 3.
Uh-huh.
Well, okay. The red is both of these pieces are needed.
Yeah. So
So if
let's skip
18
that one
are red, yeah.
because then we got a lot of options. There could be so many different numbers between them. My hint is skip that one.
Okay, so let's skip to 14 are hens.
Okay. What does that tell us?
Um the hen circle has 13 in it already. So there should be one in the
Double
missing
check.
piece. Oh,
I know
8,
it's late.
9, 10, 11, 12.
Okay.
12. So there should be 2 in that piece next to the
Ah,
right of the 3.
okay. And now we'll go back to Danielle. Is that enough to finish this one off?
Yes.
Okay.
Um, and then it would be 6.
How'd you get 6? Just talk me through it so I understand. That's all.
So I added 7 plus 3 plus 2 because they're all included in the red,
Okay.
and that gave me 12. And then I did 18 minus 12.
All right. Well,
Why does that look so
there
simple
you
here?
go.
It was not that simple. It was not that simple when I was reading the question on the
Well,
test.
yours, again, depending on what you tried here. If you tried to make a circle that said this,
I
a
did.
thin, if you did, then it will be impossible for you to be able to separate the thin chickens from the fat chickens because they're both in one circle. So
I
like
even
this
went on the
9,
back and I
Oh,
yeah,
rewrote the Venn
I
diagram and I did the circles and then
I
I
saw you. I was waiting for like your hand to come up and say, "Hold on, I have a question. What does this mean?" And I would have said, "How can you have a circle labeled fat and thin at the same time?"
well, I thought you would tell me you didn't know because technically it was like I didn't know if that was guidance or an answer. So I was like,
You're always, if you're confused about something, go ahead and ask. The worst thing that happens is you're right back to where you started, right?
that's true.
But I sometimes, like I do here, will ask you questions. I may not give you the answer, but if I say, how can you have a chicken that's fat and thin? Because like right up here, it says,
I think I
oh,
did. So I made one like rubies and shiny, opals and dull, big and like that's how
oh
I
yeah.
labeled
Oh, I
them.
hear you. I totally hear you. So I realized that because you got so specific, there is no place left in that Venn diagram for you to put things that aren't those 3 things. And by the way, by the time you did all that specific stuff, there's probably nothing in the overlap of any of them because it's
No,
so specific. So
it
yeah,
wasn't. And this makes a lot more sense when it's like watching you break it down again.
That's all it is. So if you go back to the test, I guarantee you, I gave you these numbers. And if you need to, you could come up here and say, okay, fat has to have 16, red has to have 18, hens have to have 14, right? Just don't write like 14 hens right here, because then from that point on, it's gonna be hard for you to get anything. Okay, let's hear. Let's go down. There's questions then. How many thin chickens does she have? Ooh.
Chickens.
How many thin chickens?
9.
Those
I
are thin
put
chickens. Any other thin chickens?
Oh yeah, we do. We got
So when you see thin, what goes into your mind? What are you thinking?
all of the ones that are not in fat.
Perfect. That's what I want you to do. So then just come up here and cover up fat, like even with your hand,
okay.
and everything that's not in there is thin.
Thin.
16.
I need more than that.
Oh, plus 9. So 25.
That's what I got.
I put 16 because I forgot the 9.
I
There
only
we go.
added it because that was the first thing I said.
Okay, so how many thin red roosters? Ooh, that was not one of our clues, but I bet you can still figure it out. So take a moment, don't blurt it out, so each person has a chance to think. How many of these are thin red roosters? Think for a second, then I'll ask. All right. Let's see here. Danielle, you kind of had the last one. Alex, you want to try this one?
Um, so if they're in the red or hen circle and they're not overlapping with the fat, we can assume that they're thin, right?
If they're not in the fat circle, we can assume they're thin.
Okay. So um I would say I would I think I would say 6.
Right there.
Yeah, because they're not fat and they're not hens, but they're red. Is that right?
That's it.
Nice. Okay.
So that, yeah.
What was the 9?
What would you say for the
Those were
9?
brown. Okay, they were brown.
Brown, how do you know they're brown?
Up there in the clues. There are 9 thin
Look at,
brown
ignore this. Look at the picture. Tell me how you know they're brown.
because they're not in red.
Done. That's it. And that's why when you go back and you look at it again, if you had a label for shiny, if you did, right? I'm not saying you did, but if you had put shiny down, right? And over here was what, rubies?
Yeah.
Something, right? And then large or small? I don't even remember what the other clue was. There was some other
Opal.
clue. But rubies and opals were kind of one. So that was the type. Shiny or dull. Was it small? I think it was
It was
small.
small or
Okay,
big.
small or big. Okay, so here we go. So there's small. So when you look at this circle, I know it's drawn incredibly well. This is by far the best drawing I've ever done. Could you identify what would go in this region right here? Danielle, you're up this time.
Anything that's not small and not shiny. And that's a ruby.
So they would be, because I gave clues that were it's this or this, but not both. So if it's not small, then it is.
Oh, big.
And if it's not shiny, then it is.
Dull.
So
So I don't know if you can answer this. One of the clues was dull. I think it was dull, large opal. And I tried to make one little circle catered to that because that was like a large portion of a clue. So I was like,
Sure,
okay, this all has to go in that one particular circle.
sure.
And that's kind of how I started that one. And then I got lost in the sauce.
Yep. Did you try this type of problem before the test?
No, I was studying everything
I
and did
gotcha.
not get to the Venn diagram to study it. Yeah, I
So
messed up.
this is also then like if you hear me in class saying, because I try to be really clear, I'm going to tell you I will put that on the test. That is a big one for me. So if I say I'm going to put a problem like the chicken problem on the test, right? No surprises. I'm going to do it. So let's go back to that question. Now you said large, dull opals. Where would they be on this picture that I drew?
Large dull opals would be on the outside.
There it is. And you put however many there were. You just write that number in there. All right, Alex, let's try one with you. I'll put a little symbol up here. I'll put a heart. You tell me what it is.
Okay, I think that would be things that are shiny and small, but not rubies.
Be more specific if they're not rubies.
Okay, they're shiny and small. And wait, opals are on the outside?
So, final answer.
So they're not shiny. No, they're shiny and small, and they're not opals, and they're not rubies. No.
Because this is the ruby circle. So if it's not in here,
Okay, so
it's an opal.
it's an opal, it's shiny, and it's small.
There you go.
Okay.
Well, let's try one more. Not saying that didn't go great, but let's try one more. I'll put a red X somewhere. Here's your
Okay.
red X. You tell me what it is.
I think it's shiny and a ruby and is large.
Large shiny rubies. That's where they would go. Danielle, you feeling comfortable with it now, or do you need another one?
Let's do one more only because I didn't study this one specifically because we went over it and I was feeling real confident about it. And then I looked at it and was not confident.
All right. So I will try this one that looks like a little star with a black dot. Tell me what is in that region.
That one is going to be a small dull opal.
Perfect. That's it.
Okay.
There it is.
I feel better about that. At
Okay.
least I think I do.
Yeah, much better for sure. I wish I
Yeah.
had been this calm about it
You're
before I
like,
did that.
son of a, oh, why does he
No, I was
do that?
literally sweating during that. I walked away from it and I was like, it's gonna come to me. So I walked away from it and then I came back and it still was not there.
Yeah. Well, it's like here's other questions, right? Here's a college that awarded varsity letters in crew, in swimming, and in soccer. If the awards went to 46, who lettered in all sports? How many lettered in two of the three? Very similar. Here's history, English, math, right? 8 of them liked math and English. This one liked English and history, like history and math. So 3 people liked all the subjects, right? Okay, then where could we put them? You could draw the picture for that.
Okay.
I mean, there's just a number of questions I'm saying, like if you wanted to, you can go practice additional ones if you want to. So here's the one for oh, that would confuse the crap out of me. This looks like a sorority group almost, right?
Yeah.
Alpha Pi, I think is A Pi is. Yeah, I dated one of those. Let's go to a different problem. It's got some bad memories there. So let's see. So yeah, with the math connections, if you were looking at something like this, like Seth was deciding to use DNC to represent dogs and cats, right? What would what would this region represent?
Oh wait, we had this question.
It would, yeah.
This is your question from the homework. But now that you've gone through that other question, this one might look significantly easier.
Yeah.
Like, what is region 1?
Region 1 is dogs and not cats.
They are dogs and not cats. What would be in region 2 if it could exist?
Dogs and cats.
Dogs and cats. So you can see this is a horrible Venn diagram to draw, right? Okay, region 3, Alex
That would be cats and not dogs.
and Danielle. Region 4.
Not dogs and not cats.
There you go.
So this one was on the test though, because I did not know how to answer question B because it said, how do you simplify it? And I kind of wrote out my thought process, but I felt like that was simplified so much.
Wait,
Yeah.
which one? Which one had a B with a simplified?
This one, this question was on the test. No, I answered this question somewhere.
I
I
didn't
think
put
it was
this
on the
question on the
homework.
test.
It was at the
This was
homework
on the
because
homework.
I
This was
specifically
on
remember B.
2.3 homework. Yes.
Okay, then yes, B was the one I was like, I don't know how to simplify that anymore. Then I felt like it was already
Yeah, how
pretty
could you
simple.
simplify the Venn diagram? Well, first off, don't put in a region like this where
I
nothing
think
can
that's what I
possibly
put.
exist. Like separate it. If you're going to do it, have dogs here, have cats here.
Well, I
If you
thought that
want
we
dogs
could.
and cats.
I didn't think that would be simplifying it because technically I was also thinking about the other portions that we learned where it's like logic, like, okay, is it correct? No, but like I said it. So
So I would say this one is simplified because initially when he drew his circles, there were 4 regions. Now, when he draws them this way, there are only 3 regions. Either the animal's a dog, it would go in the D circle, or it's a cat, it would go in the C circle, or it's not in those, which means it would be outside of those. That would be another way
okay,
to think of it. I mean, you could
that
try, you
makes
could say, I mean, I could completely simplify it and just call this D in the middle, right? And if you're inside the circle, then it's a dog.
dog.
And if you're outside the circle, then you are
Not a dog.
not a dog. You might be a cat, you might not. So that's, I would say this one probably simplifies it too much because it looks like Seth was trying to include both dogs and cats. And if you do one circle, you include dogs, but every other animal gets looped together. And so that's why I probably gone with something like this to simplify.
That makes sense.
Very cool.
Do you have
All right.
anything else, Danielle, or are you good?
Anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay.
At least not. I'm sure I will once I get my test back, but not right now.
Yeah, we'll wait till then.
All right. That sounds good. So I will stop at this point.
Okay.
And I'll stop recording.